Some loves are worth waiting a lifetime for. We've all felt the sting of being told we're not ready, not old enough, not the right time. When 16-year-old Ingrid poured her heart out to the warrior Vargr Stonehand, his gentle words, "Come back when you're older," weren't meant to hurt her. They were meant to honor the woman she would become. Years passed. Ingrid grew from a blacksmith's daughter into a skilled healer, while Vargr's battles left him scarred and alone. Now she's back, no longer the girl who followed him around, but a woman who knows what she wants. The question is, will he recognize the equal standing before him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories to an old heart, and Ingrid Eriksdotter breathed it in as she guided her horse down the familiar stone path toward Raven's Hollow. 8 years had passed since she'd last seen these weathered longhouses, with their carved dragon heads pointing toward the grey sky, since she'd heard the rhythmic hammer strikes echoing from her father's forge, since she'd walked these cobblestones as anything other than a memory. She was 31 now, no longer the gangly girl who used to chase chickens through the village square or braid flowers into her unruly auburn hair. Life had carved wisdom into the soft curves of her face, just as the northern winds had carved the cliffs that surrounded this place. Her hands, once soft and untested, now bore the calluses of a healer who had set bones, birthed children, and closed the eyes of the dying across 3 kingdoms, the leather satchel bouncing against her. Horse's flank contained more than just herbs and tonics. It held the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had chosen to make her own way in the world, rather than settle for the first man who would have her. She had learned the healing arts from a wise woman in the Highlands of Scotland, traded with merchants from as far south as Byzantium, and earned respect that had nothing to do with her father's name or her potential as someone's wife. But despite all her travels, all her accomplishments, this valley still felt like the center of her world. The scent of pine and wood smoke, the distant sound of axes splitting timber, the sight of fishing boats dotting the dark water. These things reached something deep in her chest that no amount of wandering had been able to touch. As she crested the hill overlooking the village proper, Ingrid's practiced eye took inventory of the changes time had wrought. The great hall had been expanded, its roof now crowned with intricate carvings that hadn't been there in her youth. New houses clustered near the harbor, speaking of prosperity and growth. But it was the training ground that drew her attention, where even now she could see figures moving in the early morning light, practicing the deadly dance of sword and shield. Her heart recognized him before her mind could process the details. Vargr Stonehand moved like winter itself, inevitable, powerful, touched with a beauty that could both nurture and destroy. 8 years had added silver to his dark hair and new scars to his already marked skin. But his presence still commanded attention from every person within 100 paces. She had been just 16 when she'd first seen him truly, not as the distant warrior who sometimes passed through their village, but as a man whose quiet strength had saved her life. The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. Raiders from across the water had struck during the harvest festival, appearing like wolves from the tree line while the village celebrated. Ingrid had been gathering flowers by the riverbank, lost in her own young dreams. When rough hands had seized her, Vargr had appeared like thunder given human form, his massive frame blocking out the sun as he'd cut down her captors with movements that seemed almost too fluid for someone his size. When the dust settled and her tears had dried, she'd looked up into eyes the color of winter storms and felt something shift in her chest, something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way he'd gently helped her to her feet, checking her for injuries with hands that could have crushed stone but touched her like she was made of spun glass. "You're safe now, little bird," he'd said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "But stay close to the village from now on. The world beyond can be cruel to those who aren't ready for its teeth." She'd been following him around like a lost puppy ever since, much to the amusement of the other villagers, and the patient resignation of Vargr himself. He never shooed her away, never spoke harshly to her enthusiasm, but he maintained the careful distance of a man who understood the difference between a girl's infatuation and a woman's choice. The spring of her 17th year had brought more than just melting snow and budding trees. It had brought a restlessness to Ingrid's spirit, a certainty that settled in her bones like the changing seasons. She'd found him alone in the grove where the apple trees bloomed, sitting on a fallen log with his sword across his knees, lost in thought. The way the morning light filtered through the blossoms had turned the world into something from a skald's tale. And she'd approached him with a sprig of flowering branch in her hands, like an offering. "Vargr," she'd said, her voice steadier than her racing heart. "I need to tell you something." He'd looked up at her with those storm-grey eyes, and she'd seen understanding flicker across his features, the kind of gentle sorrow that comes with knowing what someone will say before they say it. "I love you," she'd continued, the words tumbling out like water over stones. "I know you think I'm too young, that I don't understand what I'm feeling, but I do. I've loved you since the day you saved me, and I'll love you until the day I die. I want to be your wife, to stand beside you, to Ingrid." His voice had been soft but final, cutting through her declaration like a blade through silk. "You honor me more than you know. But love isn't just about wanting, it's about being ready for the weight of what you're asking for." He'd stood then, towering over her even more than usual, but his expression had been infinitely gentle. "Come back when you're older, little bird. When you've had time to see the world beyond this valley, to know your own heart as a woman rather than a girl. If what you feel is real, it will endure. And if it's meant to be, I'll still be here." The words had hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. He wasn't rejecting her, he was asking her to reject the easy path, to become someone worthy of the love she claimed to feel. She'd left that autumn, carrying nothing but her father's blessing, a horse, and the determination to prove that her heart knew its own mind. The spring blossom branch had gone with her, pressed between the pages of her journal as a reminder of the promise she'd made to herself, to return only when she was his equal in all the ways that mattered. Now, 8 years later, she was back. The girl who had declared her love beneath the apple blossoms was gone, replaced by a woman who had earned her place in the world through skill and determination rather than beauty or birth. She had seen enough of life to understand what Vargr had tried to tell her, that love without partnership was just pretty words, and partnership required two people who could stand as equals in the storms of life. Ingrid guided her horse down the winding path toward the village center, noting how the morning sun caught the silver threads in her dark auburn hair, how her green eyes had gained the depth that comes from seeing both joy and sorrow in equal measure. She wore practical traveling clothes, wool and leather that spoke of someone who lived by her wits rather than her appearance. But there was something in the way she carried herself that would have caught attention in any king's hall. The first person to recognize her was old Henrik, the baker who had always slipped her extra honey cakes when she was small. His flour-dusted face split into a grin wide enough to crack stone, and his shout of welcome drew curious faces from doorways and windows throughout the village. "Ingrid Eriksdottir, look what the wind has blown back to us." Word of her return spread like ripples across still water, and soon she found herself surrounded by familiar faces marked by the passage of years. Her childhood friend Astrid, now heavy with her third child, embraced her with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Bjorn the fisherman, who had taught her to tie knots and read the weather, clasped her hand in his scarred fingers and declared that she'd grown into a woman who could make the old gods themselves sit up and take notice. But through all the welcomes and exclamations, through all the questions about her travels and her plans, Ingrid's attention kept drifting to the training ground where Vargr continued his morning practice. He hadn't looked her way yet, but she could tell from the subtle tension in his shoulders that he was aware of her presence. Some connections run deeper than sight or sound, touching something primal that recognizes its other half across any distance. Her father, Eric the blacksmith, emerged from his forge, with his massive hands still dark with soot, and his beard now more grey than brown. The years had been kind to him, adding dignity to his frame without stealing his strength, and when he saw his daughter, his weathered face crumpled with joy. "My little bird," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he gathered her into arms that still smelled of iron and fire. "Welcome home. I'm not so little anymore." "Papa," she replied, but she held him tight anyway, feeling like a child again in the safety of his embrace. "No," he agreed, pulling back to study her face with eyes that held a lifetime of love and pride. "You're not. You've become everything I hoped you would, and more than I dared dream." They stood there in the morning light, father and daughter reunited, while the village bustled around them with the comfortable chaos of daily life. But even as Ingrid answered her father's questions about her travels and shared stories of the places she'd seen, part of her attention remained fixed on the training ground, where Vargr Stonehand continued his solitary practice with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. The morning stretched toward midday, marked by the familiar rhythms of village life, the ring of hammers, the lowing of cattle, the laughter of children playing by the water's edge. Ingrid helped her father in the forge, her skilled hands falling easily back into the work she'd learned at his side, but her thoughts kept drifting to the conversation she knew must come. When Vargr finally set down his weapons and turned toward the village center, their eyes met across the space between them. Time seemed to slow, the way it does in moments that matter, and Ingrid felt her heart steady into a rhythm that spoke of certainty rather than nervousness. This was why she had come home, not for the familiar comfort of her childhood, not for the approval of her family and friends, but for this moment when she could look into the eyes of the man she had loved as a girl and offer her heart again. This time, as a woman who knew her own worth. He approached slowly, the way one might approach a deer that could bolt at any sudden movement, and she could see the careful control in every step. When he stopped before her, close enough to speak without the entire village listening, she caught the scent that had haunted her dreams, leather and steel, pine smoke and something indefinably masculine that belonged to him alone. "Ingrid," he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. "Vargr," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "I kept my promise. I came back when I was older." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Vargr's eyes searched her face with the intensity of a man trying to reconcile memory with reality, and Ingrid found herself doing the same. The boy who had saved her had become a man marked by battles she could only imagine, his face bearing new scars that spoke of conflicts fought far from the safety of Ravenshollow. "You have," he said finally, his voice carrying a roughness that hadn't been there 8 years ago. "Changed, I mean." "You're different?" she supplied when he seemed to struggle for words. "Yourself," he finished, and something in the way he said it made her chest tighten with hope. "You've become who you were always meant to be." Before she could respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats thundering down the valley road. A rider approached at breakneck speed, his horse lathered with sweat and his face twisted with urgency. The entire village turned to watch as the messenger dismounted near the great hall, his legs barely supporting him as he stumbled toward the assembled crowd. "Raiders!" he gasped, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. 3 ships, black sails, moving up the coast. They hit Thornwick at dawn, burnt half the village, took the children. The words hit the gathered villagers like physical blows. Thornwick was only 2 days' sail from Ravenshollow, close enough that many of them had family or friends there. Women clutched their children closer, while the men's hands moved instinctively to their weapons. Vargr stepped forward, his entire demeanor shifting from the gentle man who had been speaking with Ingrid to the warrior who had earned his fearsome reputation. "How many children?" he asked, his voice cutting through the rising panic with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Near a dozen," the messenger replied, accepting a cup of water from one of the villagers. Boys and girls, youngest couldn't have been more than 6 summers. The raiders, they didn't seem interested in gold or livestock. Just the children. A chill ran down Ingrid's spine that had nothing to do with the northern wind. Slavers were common enough, but ones who specifically targeted children spoke of darker purposes, markets in distant lands where innocence commanded premium prices. Or worse, which direction were they heading? Vargr's questions came with military precision, each one designed to gather the intelligence he would need to act. North along the coast, but they weren't in any hurry. Looked like they were planning to make more stops. The messenger's face was grim. Jarl Gunnar sent riders to every village within a week's travel. He's calling for a war council at Ironhold, but that's 4 days from now. Those children will be long gone by then, Vargr finished, his jaw set with determination. Or worse. Ingrid watched the transformation with a mixture of admiration and growing unease. This was the man she remembered from her childhood, the one who acted when others hesitated, who placed the welfare of the innocent above his own safety. But she was no longer a child watching from the sidelines, and the thought of him riding into danger while she remained safely in the village felt like a betrayal of everything she had become. The village elders began to gather around Vargr, their weathered faces reflecting the weight of the decision before them. Harold the Wise, whose grey beard reached nearly to his belt, spoke first. The nearest Jarl's forces are 3 days away at best. If we send for help, those children will be sold into slavery or worse before any help arrives, Vargr interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. We know these waters, these shores. A small, fast force could intercept them before they reach open sea. A small force against 3 ships? Astrid's husband, Tormund, shook his head. That's madness, Vargr. We're farmers and fishermen, not warriors. I'm a warrior, Vargr replied simply. And I won't stand by while children suffer because we were too afraid to act. Ingrid felt something crystallize in her chest, not the helpless frustration of her youth, but the clear-eyed determination of a woman who had spent 8 years learning to make her own choices. She stepped forward, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with surprising authority. You're not going alone. Every eye turned to her, but she kept her gaze fixed on Vargr. His expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something that might have been pride before settling into the careful mask he wore when trying to protect others from difficult truths. Ingrid, this isn't a job for a woman? She raised an eyebrow, the gesture carrying enough edge to make several of the men take a step back. I've spent the last 8 years learning more than just herb lore. Vargr, I can handle a blade. I know these waters as well as anyone here, and those children will need a healer when we find them. When we find them... His voice carried a warning, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. The part of him that wanted to protect her warring with the part that recognized the logic in her words. Yes. When? She moved closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You taught me once that the world beyond this village can be cruel to those who aren't ready for its teeth. Well, I'm ready now, and you're going to need all the help you can get. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. The old Vargr, the one who had gently sent her away 8 years ago, would have found some way to keep her safe in the village while he rode off to face danger alone. But as she watched, she saw the exact moment when he truly saw her. Not as the girl who had confessed her love beneath the apple blossoms, but as the woman who had earned her place in the world through skill and determination. You're certain? He asked, and she heard the weight of everything they weren't saying in those 2 words. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the assembled villagers. Who else? The response was immediate. Eric the blacksmith stepped forward, his massive frame radiating determination. My daughter doesn't ride into danger without her father watching her back. Bjorn the fisherman followed, his weathered hands steady despite his advanced years. My boat's the fastest on the fjord. You'll need someone who knows every current and hidden reef between here and the open sea. One by one, other men stepped forward. Not many, but enough. Farmers who had once been warriors. Fishermen who had fought off raiders before, young men eager to prove themselves. Within minutes, Vargr had a force of 12, small but experienced and motivated by the thought of children in peril. "We leave within the hour," Vargr declared, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Light armor, weapons you can trust, supplies for 3 days. We're not going to war. We're going to bring those children home." The crowd began to disperse, people hurrying to gather supplies and prepare for what might be their last sight of loved ones. But Ingrid remained where she was, studying Vargr's profile as he spoke quietly with the men who would follow him into danger. This was her inciting incident, not just the raiders who threatened innocent children, but the moment when her 8 years of growth and preparation would be put to the test. She had come home to offer her heart to the man she loved, but instead she found herself about to ride beside him into the kind of danger that could claim them both. Yet as she watched him coordinate their response with the calm efficiency of a born leader, she felt no fear. This was what she had prepared for during her years away, not just the chance to prove her love, but the opportunity to prove herself worthy of standing beside him as an equal. The spring blossom branch in her satchel seemed to pulse with significance. She had pressed it between the pages of her journal as a young girl's promise to return. But now it represented something deeper, the faith that some things were worth any risk, and the understanding that true love meant choosing to face those risks together. As the village erupted into controlled chaos around them, Ingrid caught Vargr's eye one more time. In that look, she saw acknowledgement, respect, and something that might have been the beginning of the partnership she had dreamed of for so long. "Together?" she asked quietly. "Together," he confirmed, and the word carried the weight of everything they had once been and everything they might yet become. The hour that followed moved with the organized urgency of people who understood that hesitation could cost lives. Ingrid found herself swept into preparations that felt both foreign and familiar, the careful balance of traveling light while ensuring they had everything needed for both rescue and potential battle. She had changed from her traveling clothes into something more practical: dark wool that would blend with shadows, leather armor that had been a gift from a grateful chieftain whose son she had saved from fever, and boots designed for both riding and running. Her weapons were simple but well-maintained: a long knife at her hip, a smaller blade tucked into her boot, and a short bow with a quiver of arrows across her back. Not the arsenal of a warrior, perhaps, but the tools of someone who had learned that survival often depended on being prepared for the unexpected. As she secured her healing supplies in waterproof pouches, Ingrid's father approached with something wrapped in oiled cloth. His expression was solemn, carrying the weight of a man about to watch his daughter ride into danger. "I made this while you were away," Eric said, unwrapping a sword that took Ingrid's breath away. The blade was perfectly balanced, its steel folded and refolded until it gleamed like captured starlight. The crossguard bore intricate knotwork, and the pommel was set with a small piece of amber that caught the light like trapped fire. "I always hoped you would come back, and I wanted to be ready." Ingrid lifted the sword, feeling its weight settle into her hand with the rightness of something made specifically for her grip. The balance was perfect, not too heavy for her frame, but substantial enough to command respect. "Papa, it's beautiful. It's practical," he corrected gruffly, though his eyes shone with pride. "Beauty without function is just vanity, but beauty with purpose, that's worth something." She understood the deeper meaning in his words. He wasn't just talking about the sword, but about her, about the woman she had become and the choices she was making. As she belted the weapon at her side, she felt the weight of his approval settling around her like a mantle. Across the village square, Vargr was conducting his own preparations with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. His armor was well worn, but perfectly maintained, dark leather reinforced with steel rings that spoke of countless battles survived. His weapons were simple and deadly, a sword that had earned its reputation in blood, an axe that could split both shields and skulls, and a collection of smaller blades placed with the careful consideration of a man who understood that backup plans often meant the difference between life and death. But it was watching him interact with the other members of their hastily assembled rescue party that reminded Ingrid of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. He moved among them with quiet authority, checking their equipment not with the arrogance of someone asserting dominance, but with the care of a leader who understood that every person's survival depended on everyone else being properly prepared. When young Ragnar, barely 18 and eager to prove himself, appeared with armor that was clearly too large and weapons he could barely lift, Vargr didn't embarrass him with public criticism. Instead, he quietly guided the boy to better choices, explaining the reasoning behind each decision in a way that educated rather than belittled. "Speed will matter more than protection where we're going," Vargr explained, helping Ragnar select lighter armor. "A blow you can dodge is better than one you absorb, no matter how good your mail." Ingrid found herself smiling as she watched the interaction. This was the man who had gently refused her 8 years ago, not because he didn't care, but because he had seen something in her that needed time to grow. Now she could appreciate the wisdom in that choice, even as she wondered if he could see how much she had changed. Their eyes met across the square, and she felt that familiar jolt of connection that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with recognition. He approached her with the measured stride of someone trying to appear casual while dealing with complicated emotions. "Your father's work?" he asked, nodding toward the sword at her side. "Made while I was away," she confirmed. "He said he wanted to be ready for when I came home." "Wise man. Eric's blades have saved more lives than most healers." Vargr paused, seeming to wrestle with something before continuing. "Are you certain about this, Ingrid? There's no shame in staying behind. The village will need its healer if you don't come back," she finished, raising an eyebrow. "That's exactly why I'm going. Those children will need someone who knows how to treat injuries, terror, and worse. And you," she hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the risk. "You'll need someone watching your back who cares whether you make it home alive." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You're not the girl who used to follow me around the village." "No," she agreed. "I'm not. The question is whether you can accept the woman I've become." Before he could answer, Bjorn appeared at their side, his weathered face creased with concern. "Tide's turning in our favor, but we need to move soon if we want to catch them before they reach deep water." Vargr nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on Ingrid's face for another moment, as if trying to memorize something important. Then the moment passed, and he was back to being the leader their small group needed. "Mount up!" he called to the assembled rescue party. "We ride hard for the coast, then transfer to Bjorn's boat. Remember, our goal is the children, not glory. We get in, get them out, and get home alive." The ride to the coast took 2 hours through terrain that shifted from familiar farmland to wild forest to rocky shore. Ingrid found herself positioned near the middle of their small column, close enough to the front to participate in planning, but protected by the presence of experienced fighters on all sides. It was a compromise that spoke to Vargr's continued protective instincts while acknowledging her right to be there. As they rode, she found herself studying the men who had volunteered for this mission. Her father, grim-faced and determined, his smith's muscles more than adequate for the work ahead. Bjorn, navigating by instincts honed over decades of reading wind and water. Tormund and 3 other farmers who had set down their plows to take up swords. Young Ragnar, nervous but eager, clutching his reins with white knuckles, and Vargr, riding point with the easy confidence of someone who had spent half his life in hostile territory. She watched the way he constantly scanned their surroundings, how his hand never strayed far from his weapon, how he positioned himself to shield the others from potential threats that existed only in his experienced imagination. This was what she had missed during her 8 years away, not just the safety of home, but the privilege of watching him in his element. He moved through danger the way other men moved through their own houses, with an unconscious grace that spoke of absolute competence. When they reached the coast, Bjorn's boat waited like a promise kept. The vessel was sleek and fast, built for navigating the treacherous waters between the fjords and the open sea. As they transferred their horses to the village and loaded themselves and their weapons aboard, Ingrid felt the weight of commitment settling around them all. There would be no turning back now. Whatever waited for them in the waters ahead, whether rescue or disaster, they would face it together. The open water embraced Bjorn's boat with the familiar rhythm of swells and wind that had marked these waters since the world was young. Ingrid found herself standing near the bow, her hands gripping the rail as spray misted across her face, salt and memory combining in ways that made her chest tight with recognition. 8 years away from these waters, but her body remembered the motion, the way the deck rose and fell beneath her feet like a living thing. Bjorn worked the sail with the unconscious competence of someone who had been reading wind and current since before he could properly walk. His weathered face was creased with concentration as he adjusted their course, following currents that were invisible to the untrained eye, but clear as roads to someone with his experience. "There," he said, pointing toward a smudge of smoke on the horizon, still burning, which means they haven't been gone long. Vargr moved to stand beside him, squinting against the afternoon sun as he studied the distant shoreline. "How long?" "Hour, maybe 2. They'll be moving slow with captives aboard. Children don't travel well on rough water. And these bastards will want their cargo alive and unmarked for whatever market they're heading toward." The words sent a chill through the rescue party that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Ingrid felt her jaw clench as images flashed through her mind, memories of the children she had treated over the years who had survived similar ordeals. The hollow look in their eyes that spoke of trauma no child should ever know. How far to intercept them? Vargr's question was tactical, focused on the immediate need rather than the longer-term horror they were racing to prevent. "If we push hard and they maintain their current course, we can catch them before they clear the outer islands. After that," Bjorn shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. Once the raiders reached open water, they would have their choice of destinations, and the chances of rescue would drop to nearly nothing. Vargr nodded, then turned to address the rest of their group. "Check your weapons. Make sure everything is secure. When we catch them, there won't be time for adjustments." Ingrid used the opportunity to examine her fellow rescuers more carefully. The initial adrenaline of departure had faded, replaced by the grim determination that comes when people truly understand what they've committed themselves to. Her father's face was set in lines of iron resolve, while Tormund kept flexing his hands around the haft of his axe as if testing its weight. Young Ragnar looked pale but determined, his youth warring with his desire to prove himself worthy of standing among grown men. And Vargr moved among them like a steady presence, checking equipment, offering quiet words of encouragement, positioning himself so that his calm confidence became an anchor point for the others. She watched him adjust the strap on Ragnar's shield, saw him nod approval at her father's choice of backup weapons, observed the way he managed to be everywhere he was needed without seeming to rush or worry. "You're studying him," her father said quietly, appearing at her elbow with the silent movement that had always surprised people who expected a blacksmith to be loud and clumsy. "Am I that obvious? To someone who watched you pine after him for the better part of a year?" "Yes." Eric's voice carried gentle amusement rather than criticism. "He's changed too, you know. The man who sent you away was carrying weight that had nothing to do with your age." Ingrid turned to study her father's profile. "What kind of weight?" "The kind that comes from losing people you care about because you weren't strong enough, fast enough, or smart enough to save them." Eric's expression was thoughtful, touched with the sadness that comes from understanding painful truths. "He's buried friends, Ingrid. Good people who trusted him to bring them home alive. It changes a man. Knowing that your decisions can mean the difference between someone's children having a father or growing up orphaned." She felt something settle into place in her understanding, not just of Vargr, but of the 8 years that had passed between them. "He was protecting me from more than just an unequal relationship. He was protecting you from the guilt he carries when things go wrong, Eric confirmed. Question is, are you ready for that weight? Because if you stand beside him as an equal, you'll share in both the victories and the failures. Before she could answer, a shout from Bjorn drew everyone's attention to the horizon. There! 3 sails, black as promised, moving northeast toward the outer islands. Ingrid strained her eyes against the distance and could just make out the dark shapes that marred the blue expanse of sea and sky. The raiders' ships were larger than Bjorn's boat, but clearly built for cargo rather than speed. A design choice that might be the one thing that allowed them to catch up before it was too late. How long? Vargr asked, moving to stand beside Bjorn at the steering oar. 2 hours, maybe less if this wind holds. Bjorn adjusted their course slightly, his movements precise and confident. But we'll be coming at them from their stern quarter, which means they'll see us long before we reach them. Good, Vargr said, his voice carrying a note that made Ingrid's spine straighten with attention. I want them to see us coming. She moved closer, drawn by something in his tone that spoke of plans forming in the tactical part of his mind. What are you thinking? He turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw not the careful protector or the patient teacher, but the strategic mind that had earned him his reputation as a warrior. 3 ships full of raiders, probably 30 or 40 men total. They'll expect us to run when we see the odds. But we're not going to run. No, he agreed, a smile touching the corners of his mouth that held no warmth whatsoever. We're going to do something they won't expect from a small fishing boat full of farmers and fishermen. The pieces of his plan began to form in her mind, shaped by stories she had heard and tactical discussions she had witnessed during her travels. You're going to attack. We're going to rescue those children, he corrected. Everything else is just details. As Bjorn's boat cut through the waves toward their destination, Ingrid found herself thinking about the question her father had posed. Was she ready for the weight that came with standing beside Vargr as an equal? Ready to share in the responsibility for whatever happened next? She reached into her satchel and touched the pressed spring blossom that had traveled with her for 8 years. A reminder of promises made and kept, of faith in things worth waiting for. The girl who had picked that branch had believed in love conquering all obstacles. The woman who carried it now understood that sometimes love meant choosing to face those obstacles together. Regardless of the cost, I'm ready, she whispered to the wind, not sure if she was answering her father's question or making a promise to herself. But as the distance between them and the raiders' ships slowly closed, she felt a certainty settle into her bones that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with choice. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside the man she loved. As the equal she had spent 8 years becoming, the raiders had spotted them, just as Vargr had predicted. Through the growing tension of the approaching confrontation, Ingrid watched the 3 black-sailed ships adjust their formation, spreading out like wolves, preparing to surround prey. What they couldn't know, what Vargr was counting on, was that sometimes the prey had teeth of its own. They're signaling each other, Bjorn observed, his experienced eyes reading the subtle changes in the raiders' movements. Probably deciding whether to fight or run. They'll fight, Vargr said with certainty that came from years of reading enemy intentions. 3 ships against 1 fishing boat, they like those odds. Plus they can't afford to let word get back that they can be challenged. Bad for business. Ingrid found herself studying the approaching vessels with new eyes, seeing not just the immediate threat, but the larger implications of what they represented. These weren't desperate men driven to raiding by hunger or circumstance. They were professionals who had turned the suffering of innocence into a calculated enterprise. The realization settled something cold and determined in her chest that felt disturbingly like her father's forge fire, controlled, purposeful, and capable of reshaping whatever it touched. As the distance between them closed, details became clearer. The raiders' ships were indeed built for cargo rather than speed, their hulls modified with enclosed sections that would serve to contain captives during transport. She could see figures moving on the decks, men checking weapons, adjusting positions, preparing for what they assumed would be a brief and profitable encounter. "How many children do you think they're carrying?" she asked quietly, the healer in her already calculating what kind of trauma treatment would be needed after rescue. "Too many," Vargr replied, his jaw set in lines that spoke of barely contained fury. "Even one would be too many." Bjorn made a subtle adjustment to their course, and Ingrid realized they were no longer heading directly toward the raiders, but angling toward a position that would put them between the enemy ships and the open sea. It was a tactical decision that made her reassess both Bjorn's capabilities and Vargr's planning. "You're not just fishing boat sailors, are you?" she said, the pieces clicking together in her mind. Her father's chuckle was grim but proud. "Did you think we spent the last 8 years sitting around the fire telling stories? The world got more dangerous while you were away, daughter. We learned to meet it accordingly." Around her, the other members of their rescue party were making final preparations with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Not often, perhaps, but enough to have developed habits and procedures that spoke of experience earned the hard way. Tormund checked the edge on his axe with the careful attention of someone who understood that dull weapons meant dead friends. Ragnar's nervousness had settled into focused determination, his youth balanced by the teaching he had clearly received from older, wiser fighters. "The plan," Vargr said, his voice carrying to all of them without shouting, "is simple. Bjorn will bring us alongside the middle ship. They'll expect us to target the smallest one, but the children are most likely being held on the largest vessel where they have the most secure holding space. Ingrid, you and your father board first and secure the captives. The rest of us will keep the raiders busy while you get the children to safety. And if there are more raiders than we can handle?" Ragnar asked, his voice steady despite the fear she could see in his young eyes. "Then we make sure the children get away, whatever the cost," Vargr replied, with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that made Ingrid understand why men followed him into impossible situations. The middle ship was close enough now that they could see individual faces, scarred, weathered men who had clearly chosen violence as their profession. Their leader, a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks and a beard stained dark with what looked suspiciously like old blood, stood at the bow of his vessel with the confidence of someone who had never met an opponent he couldn't crush. "That's Grim the Bone Crusher," Bjorn said, his voice tight with recognition. "Thought he was dead. You know him?" Ingrid asked, feeling her stomach clench with new worry. "By reputation. He doesn't just raid for profit, he enjoys the work. Takes particular pleasure in breaking things that can't be easily replaced." The implications of that statement hit her like physical blows. Children who couldn't be easily replaced represented not just economic value to a man like Grim, but entertainment. The cold fury that had been building in her chest since the morning's messenger arrived suddenly blazed into something that felt dangerously close to the rage that had once driven berserkers into battle. "Ingrid," Vargr said quietly, and she realized her hand had moved to the hilt of her father's sword without conscious thought. "Stay focused. Anger can be a weapon, but only if you control it rather than letting it control you." She forced her breathing to slow, her grip to relax, her mind to clear. He was right. The children's lives depended on tactical thinking, not emotional reaction. But as Bjorn brought their boat into position for the final approach, she made a silent promise to herself and to every child who had ever suffered at the hands of men like Grim, the Bone Crusher. Today, the suffering stopped, the artifact that had traveled with her. From her youth, the pressed spring, blossom that represented hope and patient faith, seemed to pulse with new meaning as she touched the leather satchel where it rested. It was no longer just a symbol of love waited for, but of promises that would be kept regardless of the cost. "Ingrid," her father said, appearing at her side with a length of rope and a grim smile. "Ready to show these bastards what a blacksmith's daughter can do when she's properly motivated." "More than ready," she replied, and meant every word. The final approach had begun, and with it the test of everything she had become during her 8 years away from home. But as she watched Vargr coordinate their attack with the calm precision of a master tactician, as she felt the solid presence of her father beside her and the determined courage of their companions around her, Ingrid realized that she was no longer the girl who had needed rescuing by the riverbank all those years ago. This time, she would be doing the rescuing, and heaven help anyone who tried to stop her. The moment before battle has a quality all its own, a crystalline clarity where time seems to slow and every detail becomes sharp enough to cut. Ingrid felt it now as Bjorn's boat closed the final distance to the raiders' vessel. The sound of water against hull, mixing with the harsh laughter of men who believed themselves predators about to claim easy prey. She could see individual faces now, scarred and cruel, weapons held with the casual confidence of professionals who had done this dance too many times to count. But she could also see something else, the subtle signs of complacency that came from years of victory against weaker opponents. These men had grown comfortable with their dominance, and comfort in battle was often the first step toward defeat. Grim the Bone Crusher stood at the rail of his ship like a mountain given human form, his massive frame draped in mail that had clearly seen extensive use. His weapon of choice was a war hammer that looked capable of crushing stone, and his pale eyes held the kind of emptiness that spoke of a man who had long ago stopped seeing other people as anything more than obstacles or entertainment. "Remember," Vargr said, his voice carrying clearly to all of them despite the wind and spray, "we're not here to win a glorious battle. We're here to save children. Everything else is secondary." The words settled into Ingrid's mind like an anchor, providing focus that cut through the adrenaline and fear that threatened to overwhelm her careful planning. She had spent years learning to compartmentalize during medical emergencies, to push aside emotion in favor of the clear thinking that saved lives. This was no different, except that the lives at stake included not just the captive children, but everyone on their small boat. As they drew alongside the raider vessel, she caught her first glimpse of what they were truly fighting for. Small faces appeared briefly at a barred opening in the ship's hull, children ranging from perhaps 6 years old to early teens, their eyes wide with terror and desperate hope. The sight hit her like a physical blow, but it also crystallized her resolve into something that felt harder than her father's finest steel. "Now," Vargr said, and everything happened at once. Bjorn brought their boat alongside with the precision of someone who had been navigating treacherous waters since childhood, while grappling hooks flew through the air to secure the vessels together. The raiders, clearly expecting easy victory against what appeared to be a boat full of farmers and fishermen, moved to repel boarders with the lazy confidence of wolves confronting rabbits. They were about to discover their mistake. Vargr went over the rail first, his massive frame moving with a fluid grace that belonged more to a dancer than a warrior. His sword took the first raider in the chest before the man could even raise his weapon, and his follow-through sent 2 more stumbling backward into their companions. But it was the way he moved, without wasted motion, without hesitation, with the absolute confidence of someone who had done this so many times. It had become instinct that told the raiders they had gravely miscalculated. Ingrid followed immediately behind him, her father's sword in her hand and years of training guiding her movements. The first raider to confront her clearly expected an easy victory against what appeared to be just another village woman, right up until her blade opened his throat with a precision that spoke of extensive anatomical knowledge and considerable practice. The look of surprise in his eyes as he fell would have been comical under other circumstances. As it was, she simply stepped over his body and moved toward the hold where the children were being kept, trusting Vargr and the others to keep the remaining raiders busy. Her father was beside her, his smith's hammer crushing skulls with the same efficiency he had once used to shape red-hot iron. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of battle, the ring of steel on steel, The harsh breathing of men fighting for their lives. The occasional cry of pain or triumph that marked the ebb and flow of combat. But her focus was on the heavy wooden door that stood between her and the captive children. It was barred from the outside and reinforced with iron bands that spoke of experience in keeping desperate people contained. Under normal circumstances, it might have taken considerable time to break through such a barrier. Fortunately, these weren't normal circumstances, and she wasn't working alone. "Stand back," her father said, raising his hammer with the kind of focused intention that had once shaped the finest weapons in 3 kingdoms. The door lasted exactly 3 blows before the bar snapped and the iron bands twisted beyond usefulness. As it swung open, Ingrid found herself looking into a cramped space that held more suffering than she had seen in years of treating battlefield injuries. 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to perhaps 14, huddled together in chains that were clearly designed to prevent escape while avoiding permanent damage to valuable merchandise. Their faces showed the kind of terror that came from witnessing things no child should ever see, and several bore bruises that spoke of rough handling during their capture. "We're here to take you home," Ingrid said, her voice carrying the gentle authority she had learned while treating frightened patients. "My name is Ingrid, and I'm a healer. Can you tell me who needs help first?" The oldest boy, perhaps 13, with the kind of premature maturity that came from being forced to protect younger siblings, spoke for the group. "They said they were taking us to the slave markets in the east. They said no one would come for us because we weren't worth the risk." "They were wrong," Ingrid replied, already working to free him from his chains with tools she carried for just such purposes. "People came, and we're taking you home." As she worked, she could hear the battle continuing above them, the sound of her father's hammer finding targets, the distinctive ring of Vargr's sword cutting through armor and bone, the shouts and curses of raiders, discovering that their easy prey had turned into something considerably more dangerous. But she could also hear something else, a change in the rhythm of the fighting that suggested the tide was turning in their favor. The lazy confidence of the raiders was giving way to desperate fury, and desperate enemies made mistakes that skilled fighters could exploit. One by one, the children were freed from their chains, and one by one, Ingrid guided them toward the doorway that led to freedom. But as the last child was released, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of reinforcements arriving from the other raider ships. The easy part was over. Now came the real test of whether her 8 years of growth had truly prepared her for the weight of standing beside Vargr as an equal. The sound of additional raiders boarding their captured vessel reached Ingrid's ears, just as she was helping the last child to his feet. Through the narrow opening that served as the hold's only window, she could see the other 2 raider ships moving closer, their crews preparing to overwhelm what they now understood was a more serious threat than they had initially anticipated. "Papa!" she called to her father, who was checking the children for serious injuries with the gentle efficiency of someone who had raised a daughter and understood how to comfort the frightened. "How much time do we have?" Eric's weathered face was grim as he peered out at the approaching vessels. "Not enough. They're bringing at least 20 more fighters, and our people are already engaged with the crew from this ship." Above them, the sounds of battle had intensified rather than diminished, suggesting that Grimm and his men were proving more resilient than hoped. The rhythmic clash of weapons was punctuated by shouts and curses in languages that spoke of raiders drawn from across the known world, professional killers who had gathered under Grimm's banner not just for profit, but for the pleasure of inflicting suffering. Ingrid made a decision that 8 years ago would have been impossible for the girl who needed rescuing. "Get the children to Bjorn's boat. I'm going up to help Vargr." "Absolutely not," Eric said, his voice carrying the authority of a father who had spent years protecting his daughter from the world's harder edges. "Your job is to keep these children safe, not to—" "My job," Ingrid interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that matched any blade her father had ever forged, "is to make sure we all get home alive." And that means Vargr doesn't face 20 fresh raiders while he's already fighting for his life. She could see the war playing out across her father's face, the desire to protect her warring, with the recognition that she was no longer someone who needed protection. The moment stretched between them, heavy with 8 years of separation and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Finally, Eric nodded. "Be careful, little bird. The world would be a poorer place without you in it." Ingrid kissed his weathered cheek, tasting salt and soot and the love that had shaped her childhood. Then she turned toward the ladder that led to the deck above, her father's sword in her hand and determination in her heart. What she found when she emerged into the afternoon sunlight was chaos, painted in shades of blood and steel. Vargr stood near the center of the deck, his back to the mast, surrounded by bodies that testified to his skill, but also by living enemies who pressed closer with each passing moment. His armor was torn in several places, and she could see dark stains that spoke of wounds that would need attention if he lived long enough to receive it. Tormund and 2 of the other farmers fought near the bow, their movements showing the desperation of men who understood they were outnumbered but refused to yield. Young Ragnar was down, his leg twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. But he still clutched his sword and snarled defiance at any raider who came too close. And dominating the scene like a force of nature was Grim the Bone Crusher himself, his massive warhammer leaving trails of destruction as he methodically worked his way toward Vargr with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. But it was what Ingrid saw beyond the immediate battle that sent ice through her veins and changed everything she thought she knew about their situation. Standing at the rail of the approaching ship, watching the fight with the detached interest of someone observing a performance, was a figure she recognized from her travels, a man whose presence here meant this was no random raiding expedition. Jarl Eirik the Ruthless, called the Kingmaker by those who feared him and the Oathbreaker by those who had learned to hate him, was supposed to be 3 days' sail away, attending a war council. His presence here now with these particular raiders meant that everything they thought they understood about this situation was wrong. The children hadn't been taken by opportunistic slavers looking to make quick profit from vulnerable targets. They had been taken as bait, designed to draw out exactly the kind of rescue attempt that Vargr would be unable to resist. This entire situation was a trap, and they had walked into it with their eyes wide open and their hearts full of righteous determination. Worse, if Eirik was here, it meant he had broken his oath of alliance with the local jarls and was making a move to consolidate power in this region. The children were just the opening gambit in a larger game that would leave dozens of villages at the mercy of a man who had earned his reputation by showing none. But even as the implications of this discovery crashed over her like a cold wave, Ingrid realized something else, something that might be the key to turning disaster into victory. Eric's presence here was also a weakness, because it meant he had committed himself to a position far from his main forces, relying on hired raiders rather than his own sworn warriors. If they could capture or kill him here, they could end his ambitions before they truly began. But that would require getting close enough to a man who was surrounded by professional killers and protected by years of paranoid caution. She looked across the deck at Vargr, still fighting for his life against overwhelming odds, and made another decision that would have been impossible for the girl she had once been. Moving with the quick, decisive steps of someone who had learned to act while others hesitated, she pulled a small vial from her healer's kit. Not one of the medicines that saved lives, but one of the poisons that ended them. The substance within was extracted from a particular type of mushroom that grew in the deep forests of the north, colorless and tasteless, but deadly within minutes of consumption. She had acquired it years ago from an old woman who had taught her that healing sometimes required the wisdom to know when death was the more merciful option. She had never used it, but she had always carried it, understanding that knowledge unused was often knowledge useless. Now, as she watched Erik the Ruthless directing his raiders with the casual arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable, she finally understood what it was for. The pressed spring blossom in her satchel seemed to pulse with significance as she formulated her plan. It had been a symbol of patient love, of promises kept and faith rewarded. But now it would become something else, a reminder that sometimes love meant making choices that extracted a price from the one making them. She could save Vargr, save their companions, save the children, and save her village from the threat that Erik represented. But doing so would require her to become someone she had never imagined herself becoming, someone who killed, not in the heat of battle, but with cold calculation and careful planning. The question was whether she was ready to pay that price, and whether the woman Vargr had asked her to become was someone he could still love when the deed was done. The weight of the poison vial in Ingrid's hand felt heavier than her father's sword, heavier than the chainmail she wore, heavier than all the years of preparation that had brought her to this moment. Around her, the battle raged with increasing desperation as more raiders poured onto the deck from the approaching ships. But her focus had narrowed to a single terrible clarity of purpose. Erik the Ruthless stood perhaps 30 paces away, close enough that she could see the calculating intelligence in his pale eyes as he directed his forces with the casual efficiency of someone who had orchestrated dozens of similar operations. He wore no armor, carried no weapon, the arrogance of a man so surrounded by protection that he believed himself untouchable. That arrogance might be his downfall if she could find a way to exploit it, but first, she had to survive the next few minutes, and that meant helping Vargr and the others fight their way out of the trap they had walked into. She moved across the deck with the fluid grace that 8 years of training had given her. Her father's sword cutting down raiders who turned to face this new threat. But unlike the desperate fury of cornered prey, her movements carried the cold precision of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm where only results mattered. The first raider to confront her died with surprise still written across his scarred features. The second managed to raise his shield before her blade opened his throat. The third actually got his sword up in time to parry her initial strike, but found himself unprepared for the follow-through that sent her point through his ribs and into his heart. By the time she reached Vargr's position near the mast, she had carved a path through 6 men who had expected to face a village healer rather than someone who had spent years learning that sometimes the best medicine was preventing injuries from occurring in the first place. Ingrid! Vargr's voice carried relief, surprise, and something that might have been pride as she stepped into position beside him, her blade moving to intercept a strike aimed at his exposed flank. "What are you doing up here?" "The children are safe with my father," she replied, her swordwork never pausing as she spoke. "But we have a bigger problem than these raiders." She nodded toward the approaching ship, where Erik stood, watching their struggle with detached interest. "Jarl Eirik the Ruthless. This whole thing is a trap. The children were bait to draw us out, and he's here to finish whatever larger game he's playing." Vargr's expression shifted as the implications hit him, his tactical mind immediately grasping what her discovery meant for their situation. "How long have you known?" "Just figured it out," she admitted, ducking under a wild swing from Grim's warhammer while her own blade found the gap in another raider's armor. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Around them, their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Tormund was down, clutching a wound in his side that painted his shirt crimson. 2 of the other farmers lay still near the bow, their weapons fallen from lifeless hands. Young Ragnar continued to fight from his position on the deck, but his injured leg meant he could only defend rather than attack. Even Bjorn, who should have been safely aboard his own vessel with the rescued children, had been forced to join the fighting as raiders attempted to board their escape route. His weathered face was set in lines of grim determination, but she could see that he was being slowly pushed back toward positions that would cut off their retreat. "We need to end this quickly," Vargr said, his breathing labored but his sword arm still strong. Before they wear us down or more reinforcements arrive, Ingrid felt the weight of the poison vial against her ribs, its presence a reminder of the choice she had already made. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Tell me, Eric thinks he's safe over there, directing this from a distance. If something happened to him, if he were to suddenly become ill or collapse, his men would lose coordination, might even retreat rather than risk their own lives for a dead employer. Vargr's eyes found hers across the chaos of battle, and she saw understanding dawn in them, not just of what she was proposing, but of what it would cost her to do it. Ingrid, no. There has to be another way. If there is, I can't see it. She parried another strike, her movements automatic while her mind focused on the logistics of what she was proposing. I can get close to him. Healers are always welcome, especially when there are wounded men around. One moment of distraction, one sip from a cup I've prepared, and this ends. And if you're caught? The question hung between them like a blade, sharp with implications neither wanted to voice. If she failed, if she was discovered before the poison could take effect, Eric would make her death an object lesson that would be remembered for generations. Men like him didn't simply kill traitors, they crafted their endings into art forms designed to discourage others from similar attempts. Then you get the children home and make sure this was worth it, she replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. For a moment, time seemed suspended despite the chaos around them. She could see the war playing out across Vargr's features, the desire to protect her warring with the recognition that she was right, that this might be their only chance to turn disaster into victory. Finally, he nodded. What do you need? A distraction, something that will draw their attention while I slip away and approach from their blind side. She paused, studying the layout of the ships and the positioning of the enemy forces. And someone to watch over the children while I'm gone. Your father won't let anything happen to them. I know. But promise me, if this goes wrong, if I don't come back, get them to safety. Don't let guilt or sentiment trap you into trying a rescue that will just get more people killed. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but they needed to be said. 8 years ago, she had been someone who needed rescuing. Now she was someone willing to sacrifice herself so that others could live. And that transformation felt both liberating and terrifying. Ingrid, promise me. Vargr. He looked into her eyes and saw something there that made him nod slowly. I promise. But you come back to me, do you understand? I've waited 8 years for you to return, as the woman you were meant to be. I'm not losing you now to some bastard's ambition. The words hit her like physical blows, carrying the weight of everything they had never said to each other. Everything that had been building between them since her return to the village. This was his answer to the question she had posed as a girl. Not just that he could accept the woman she had become, but that he had been waiting for her to become exactly this person. I love you too, she said, the words coming easily, despite the chaos around them. I always have and I always will. That's why I have to do this. She kissed him then, quickly, but with 8 years of waiting behind it, tasting salt and copper and the promise of a future that might never come. Then she was moving, slipping away from the main battle toward the rail, where she could make her way to Eric's ship. Behind her, she heard Vargr rallying their remaining fighters for one final push, the distraction she had asked for, the chance to approach her target while attention was focused elsewhere. The pressed spring blossom in her satchel seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a reminder of promises made and choices that could never be undone. As she prepared to climb aboard the ship that held her target, Ingrid allowed herself one moment to imagine what might have been, a life spent healing rather than killing, building rather than destroying, creating children rather than orphaning them. But some prices were worth paying, and some choices had to be made regardless of their cost. 8 years ago, Vargr had told her to come back when she was older, when she was ready for the weight of the world. Now she was about to prove just how much weight she was prepared to carry, and how far she was willing to go to protect the people she loved. The girl who had picked spring blossoms and dreamed of simple love was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that sometimes love meant making choices that extracted a piece of your soul as payment, time. To collect what was owed, the space between ships was less than a sword's length. But crossing it meant leaving behind everything familiar and entering the domain of a man whose reputation had been built on the suffering of others. Ingrid forced herself to breathe steadily as she climbed aboard Eric's vessel, her healer's bag prominent on her shoulder and her weapons concealed. Beneath a cloak that marked her as a non-combatant, the deck of the Ruthless's ship was organized chaos, wounded, raiders being tended to by rough field surgeons, officers shouting orders to coordinate the assault, and supplies being moved to support the ongoing battle. But at the center of it all stood Eric himself, his pale eyes moving constantly as he assessed the tactical situation with the cold calculation of someone who viewed human lives as pieces on a gaming board. He was smaller than she had expected, not the giant that Grimm represented, but a man of average height, whose presence seemed to expand beyond his physical dimensions through sheer force of will. His clothes were rich but practical, his weapons were present but not ostentatious, and his manner suggested someone who had learned that true power lay not in intimidation, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing others would do the intimidating for You there, he called as she approached, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. Healer, my men have need of your skills. Ingrid inclined her head in the respectful manner of someone who understood their place in the hierarchy. Of course, my lord. Where would you have me begin? The worst cases first. I need fighting men, not corpses. He gestured toward a section of the deck where several raiders lay groaning with wounds that spoke of encounters with very skilled opponents. Show me what 8 years of learning your craft has taught you. The words sent ice down her spine. He knew who she was, had known from the moment she set foot on his deck. This wasn't the opportunistic recruitment of a convenient healer, but another layer of the trap he had laid for them all. Surprised, Eric's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone whose planning had anticipated every possibility. Did you think I wouldn't recognize the blacksmith's daughter who disappeared for 8 years, only to return at exactly the moment when her childhood infatuation needed assistance? You've grown skilled, I'll grant you that. But you're still thinking like someone who believes in coincidence. Around them, his men continued their work with the disciplined efficiency of professionals. But she could feel the subtle shift in attention that meant weapons were being positioned, escape routes were being closed, and options were disappearing with each passing second. The question, Eric continued, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather, is what you thought you could accomplish here. Did you imagine you could somehow turn the tide of battle, rescue your companions through force of will and righteous determination? Or perhaps his eyes found the healer's bag at her side. You had something more subtle in mind. Ingrid felt the weight of the poison vial against her ribs like a brand, its presence suddenly as obvious as if she had been carrying a lit torch. But 8 years of dealing with suspicious patients and hostile situations had taught her to maintain composure even when circumstances spiraled beyond control. I came to tend the wounded, she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Nothing more. Of course you did. Eric stepped closer, his movement casual, but calculated to limit her options for sudden movement. And the fact that your arrival coincided with a rather dramatic escalation in the fighting aboard Grimm's ship is pure coincidence, as is the fact that you chose to approach my vessel rather than flee with the children you ostensibly came to rescue. Behind the facade of calm conversation, she could hear the sounds of battle intensifying, the clash of weapons, the shouts of combatants, the screams of the wounded and dying. Vargr was keeping his promise to provide a distraction, but every moment she spent in conversation was a moment closer to the collapse of their position. You're wondering how much time you have, Eric observed, his pale eyes reading her thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. Whether your companions can hold out long enough for you to complete whatever desperate plan brought you here. The answer is not nearly enough, He gestured toward the ongoing battle, where even from this distance she could see that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Grim has orders to take prisoners where possible. Alive captives have uses that dead heroes do not. But those orders can change very quickly if circumstances require it. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual efficiency of someone who had spent years learning how to apply pressure in exactly the right places to achieve maximum effect. But as Ingrid listened to his words, she realized something that sent hope flickering through her despair. He was talking too much. Men who were truly confident in their position didn't need to explain their advantages or elaborate on their cleverness. They simply acted and let results speak for themselves, which meant there was something about this situation that worried him, something that made him feel the need to maintain control through words rather than simply through force. Eric's need to explain his cleverness was the opening Ingrid had been waiting for. While he spoke, she let her healer's instincts guide her movements, kneeling beside one of the wounded raiders as if beginning her work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking wounds and assessing injuries. But her mind was focused on the tactical situation developing around her. The wounded raider she was examining had taken a sword thrust to the shoulder. Painful, but not immediately life-threatening. More importantly, he was positioned between her and Eric, close enough to the ship's rail that sudden movement might create opportunities that careful planning could not. "You're very good at that," Eric observed, moving closer to watch her work. 8 years well spent, it would seem. Tell me, did you learn poison work during your travels, or was that a skill acquired closer to home? The question confirmed what she had already suspected. He knew about the vial, possibly had known about it from the moment she boarded his ship. But his knowledge also revealed something useful. He was curious about her capabilities, rather than simply eliminating the threat she represented. Curiosity could be exploited in ways that certainty could not. "Every healer learns about poisons," she replied, her voice carrying the mild tone of someone discussing professional techniques. "How else can you treat someone who has been poisoned if you don't understand what you're fighting against?" Indeed. And some healers learn that the line between medicine and murder is sometimes narrower than patients would prefer to believe. Eric's smile was cold, but appreciative. "Show me what you brought. It wasn't a request." Around them, his men had positioned themselves with the subtle precision of people who had done this before, creating a circle that looked casual but would prevent any sudden movement toward their leader. She was trapped as thoroughly as if she had been chained. But the trap itself was also a form of information. Eric believed she was dangerous enough to require careful handling, which meant he respected her capabilities, even as he controlled her options. That respect might be the key to turning his trap against him. "Very well," she said, reaching into her healer's bag with movements slow enough to avoid triggering a violent response from his guards. The poison vial emerged, its clear contents catching the afternoon light like captured water. Mushroom extract. Colorless, tasteless, and effective within minutes. Elegant, Eric admitted, accepting the vial with the appreciation of someone who understood quality craftsmanship regardless of its intended application. "I assume you had some plan for introducing this into my food or drink?" "Something like that." Ingrid watched him examine the vial, noting how his attention focused on the substance rather than maintaining awareness of her movements. Curiosity was indeed a weakness that could be exploited. "The flaw in your plan," he continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone explaining a clever solution, "is that you assumed I would be careless enough to accept food or drink from someone I hadn't personally vetted. Years of survival have taught me to be more cautious than that." As he spoke, he removed a small silver needle from his belt, a tool designed for testing suspicious substances before consumption. But as he prepared to examine her poison more closely, Ingrid made her move. The wounded raider she had been treating became her weapon, his weight and momentum carrying him forward as she grabbed his shoulders and rolled sideways toward the ship's rail. Eric's guards, positioned to prevent her from approaching their leader, were caught off balance by movement in the opposite direction. In the confusion that followed, she retrieved something from her healer's bag that was far more dangerous than the poison vial Eric still held, a small clay pot that contained not medicine, but one of the fire mixtures her father used in his forge, the kind that burned hot enough to melt iron and spread fast enough to consume wooden ships in minutes. "The real flaw in my plan," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden chaos as Eric's guards scrambled to reposition themselves, "was letting you think the poison was the only weapon I brought." She smashed the clay pot against the ship's mast, where it released its contents in a gout of flame that caught the rigging and began spreading with terrifying speed. The substance her father had created for shaping metal turned out to be equally effective at destroying the things that kept ships afloat. "Kill her!" Eric shouted, his composure finally cracking as he realized the true nature of the trap she had laid for him. But his men were already moving away from the spreading fire, and his ship was beginning to list as flames reached the sails and rigging. Ingrid didn't wait to see the results of her handiwork. With the spring blossom pressed against her heart like a talisman, she went over the rail and into the dark water below, trusting to luck and skill to get her back to the people who mattered most. Behind her, Eric the Ruthless discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who understood that victory was worth any price, including the one willing to pay it. The water was shockingly cold, driving the breath from Ingrid's lungs and threatening to drag her down into the dark depths where heroes were forgotten and stories ended in silence. Above her, she could hear the sounds of chaos as Eric's ship burned, the flames spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated through rigging and sail and the carefully organized world of a man who had believed himself untouchable. But she had no time to appreciate the success of her desperate gambit. The chainmail she wore, practical for fighting but treacherous in water, pulled at her with each stroke as she fought her way toward the surface. Her father's sword, the weapon that had carried her through the battle and into legend, now threatened to become the anchor that dragged her to an unmarked grave beneath the waves. She let it go. The blade that had been forged with love and hope, and 8 years of patient waiting, sank into the depths, released not from defeat, but from the understanding that some things mattered more than the tools used to achieve them. Her life, their lives, were worth more than any weapon, no matter how perfectly crafted or lovingly made. When she finally broke the surface, gasping and struggling against the weight of waterlogged armor, the first thing she saw was Vargr's face above her. He hung over the rail of their boat, his expression torn between relief and terror as he reached down to pull her from the water that had nearly claimed her. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough with emotion as his powerful hands closed around her arms. "I've got you!" The strength that lifted her from the sea was more than physical. It was the accumulated force of 8 years of waiting, of promises kept and faith rewarded, of a love that had grown from childhood infatuation into something that could move mountains or burn ships or pull drowning women from the dark embrace of defeat. When she collapsed onto the deck of Bjorn's boat, shivering and exhausted but alive, the first thing she saw was the faces of the children they had come to rescue. 12 pairs of eyes looked at her with the kind of wonder that belonged to people who had witnessed miracles. Their young faces reflecting the understanding that sometimes ordinary people did extraordinary things simply because those things needed doing. "Is it over?" asked the oldest boy, his voice carrying hope that was almost too fragile to touch. "It's over," Vargr confirmed, his gaze moving from Ingrid to the burning wreckage that had once been Eirik's ship. "The bad men can't hurt you anymore." Around them, the aftermath of battle painted the water in shades of smoke and debris. Grimm's ship, deprived of leadership and coordination, had surrendered rather than continue fighting a battle that no longer served any purpose. The surviving raiders would face justice, but more importantly, they would no longer threaten innocent children or peaceful villages. The third ship, seeing the destruction of their leader's vessel and the collapse of their coordinated attack, had fled toward open water rather than risk being trapped in a tactical situation that offered no advantage. Cowards at heart, they had chosen survival over loyalty the moment the odds shifted against them. As Bjorn guided their boat toward home, Ingrid found herself wrapped in a cloak that smelled of wood smoke and safety, her head resting against Vargr's shoulder, while her body slowly remembered what it felt like to be warm and alive. The spring blossom, somehow still pressed against her heart despite everything that had happened, felt like a promise kept and a new beginning offered. "You came back," he said quietly, his voice carrying 8 years of waiting and the relief of someone who had feared he might lose everything just as it was finally within reach. "I promised I would," she replied, her fingers finding the waterlogged leather of her satchel where the pressed flower waited. Both times, he understood what she meant, that she had kept both promises, the one made as a girl to return when she was older, and the one made as a woman to come back from whatever danger threatened them all. The weight of those promises and the cost of keeping them settled between them like something that would never need to be spoken aloud, but would always be understood. 3 days later, they reached Raven's Hollow to find the entire village waiting at the harbor. Word of their mission had spread, as such things always did in small communities, and the sight of their boat returning with its precious cargo of rescued children brought tears to eyes that had seen too much sorrow over the years. Eric, the blacksmith, stood at the front of the crowd, his weathered face creased with pride and relief as he watched his daughter step onto the dock with the steady confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than before. Behind him, the families of the rescued children waited with the desperate hope of people who had never dared believe they might see their loved ones again. But it was later that evening, as the celebration feast wound down and the village settled into the peaceful rhythms of safety restored, that Ingrid and Vargr found themselves alone together in the grove where the apple trees bloomed. The spring blossoms had given way to summer growth, but the memory of that earlier season lingered in the warm air that carried the promise of harvest and renewal. "So," he said, his voice carrying gentle humor as they sat together on the same fallen log where she had once confessed her love. "You came back when you were older." "I did," she agreed, her hand finding his with the natural ease of people who no longer needed to question whether they belonged together. "Was it worth the wait?" His answer came not in words, but in the kiss they shared beneath the stars, surrounded by the scent of growing things and the sound of a village sleeping safely, because two people had learned that sometimes love meant being willing to pay any price to protect it. The pressed spring blossom, now dried and fragile but still treasured, rested in her satchel as a reminder of promises kept and new ones yet to be made. Some loves, as it turned out, really were worth waiting a lifetime for.